Welcome back, everybody. Yours truly, Warner Lewis, of course, from the flight deck at Lewis at Large Radio. And, of course, that means some smart talk radio is in your future. And this segment, certainly no exception. A little American history here. Interesting angle indeed. We're going to be talking to Larry Tagg, considered one of America's foremost experts on Abraham Lincoln. Several works about Lincoln. He's also has written a book called The Generals of Gettysburg, which was a selection of the Military Book Club, done previous works about Lincoln. The one we're going to be talking about today specifically is called The Battles That Made Abraham Lincoln, an interesting take on a very popular president. And with that is sort of a rough setup. Larry, how are you, my friend?
I'm good, Warren. Thank you very much.
Good. Abraham Lincoln is much talked about. There was a recent sort of sci-fi movie about him, and soon to be released the Spielberg work that looks like it may be definitive. But so he is always sort of part of the presidential conversation for sure. What in particular, to set up for our Lewis at Large listeners, why your intense interest in our 16th president?
Well, I was more interested in the battles that he had to fight against the people in the North to do what he had to do. As a matter of fact, I think it makes it better history to know that, he really came in as a really unpopular guy. As a matter of fact, when he took office, well, let me just set the stage here a little bit. First of all, the presidency itself was kind of in disrepute at the time. Like the previous four presidents were like, when you see the presidential ratings every 4 years or so, the historians get together and rate the presidents. Previous four guys are always down there at the very bottom. So everybody was used to bad presidents. And this was a time when they still remembered people like, the Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and they thought, what have we come to? And what had happened in the meantime was the nominating process, the political conventions and stuff. So they were kind of thinking, we don't know how to do it anymore. We don't know how to choose presidents like we used to. And Lincoln appeared at the beginning to be the worst of the lot. He was, he never been the executive of anything larger than a two-person law office, for one thing. He was actually the least qualified guy ever to be elected president. And everybody was kind of, holding their heads and wondering how we'd gotten this guy. So he comes into office, and immediately half the country secedes from the Union. So everybody that had voted for Lincoln was thinking, man, what a mistake that was. So he actually came, when he took the oath of office on March the 4th, 1861, he had about a 25%, and this is speaking of the whole nation, 25% approval rating, which is hard to imagine, but that's actually the case. And then, the war started, and the heat of the war argument, the whole Civil War thing, just tore the nation apart so that everybody was separated into the extremes. And he was the guy that was in the middle most of the time, and there was nobody in the middle. Everybody was either the abolitionists were on one side, and the Democrats were conservatives on the other side, saying we shouldn't be in this war anyway. And it was just really a hard position to be in for Lincoln to try to pull the nation along, as he did, in the middle, where there was really nobody. So anyway, he just had the book that I wrote was about the hard time that he had in the North during the Civil War to do what he had to do. And I guess the thesis of the whole thing, the whole idea is that he did more with less political capital than any president in the nation's history, and that's why we think so highly of him now. But they didn't at the time.
Right. It always seems when you see Lincoln portrayed and you read about him, he does seem like a lonely figure, not only at war with both sides, but sometimes in conflict in his own mind. I'm curious as to this is one of those sort of settle a bet questions. Lot of different opinion. Where did he, as a not as a politician, not as the president, but as a person, where did he come down philosophically on the issue of slavery and states' rights in general?
On the issue of slavery, he had always been against slavery. I think what has gotten controversial is actually his opinion on race, which was, Illinois at the time was a state that did not allow black people to enter the state, and that wasn't an old law. That was a new law as of 1860. So people of Illinois, where he was, where he kind of grew up politically, they were not a kind of a battle hymn of the republic type of let us die to make men free type of state. And he was, although he said later, he said, I've always been against slavery, and he always had been against slavery. But where you see the modern people take him to task was where he talked about race, when he many times, he didn't think. He was kind of where his basic electorate was about race. They didn't think that there was an equality of races. He thought that the black people should have votes, but very little besides that, I think.
He is.
I think that's where the controversy comes in about the slavery thing, mainly about his attitudes towards race, which were, not what we would think of as forward, leaning today. And what was the other? Slavery and the states' rights.
Yeah, just in general. Yeah, because
the states' rights question kind of came to a head, obviously, with the states dropping out of the Union right before the Civil War, and he didn't think they had the right to do it. He said no nation includes in its constitution a right to disassemble itself. So he was very anti-states' rights, and that's the thing that modern. There's still a number of some of them are Lincoln haters, some of them are just people that disagree with his stand on states' rights, but they still think that he had the wrong idea about states' rights. And that debate still goes on today. You're right.
Yeah. Hey, if you've just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis, again from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. In the midst, this was some Smart Talk Radio with Larry Tagg, one of America's foremost experts on the 16th president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, specifically a new work called The Battles That Made Abraham Lincoln. Larry, let's dive into that a little bit. We know he was sort of an embattled presidency, sort of from coast to coast and north to south, but even more specifically, share with us some of these political battles that he fought, whether he wanted to or not, because, and let me ask a sort of a sidebar question as you talk about that. You never felt that Abraham Lincoln saw himself as a politician. I think the stereotype was this was a decent man who felt he had something to contribute, and probably in his heart really didn't like the game of politics.
I think that the opposite is true, Warner. I think that he was one of the best politicians that we ever had, and he certainly saw himself as a politician. But in the best sense that he was a master of the art of the possible. He was really good at seeing. First of all, he was really good at the machinery of the political machinery, which was considerable at the time and still is, obviously. And so he knew what he could do, he knew what he couldn't do, and that was really the cause of a lot of the people's, just grief about what he was doing, was that some people thought he was going too slowly, some people thought he was going too fast with things like emancipation and things like that. But I think he was, and certainly at the time, people considered him very much a politician, and I think he kind of held that up as a good thing rather than a bad thing. but I don't think he was like your Mr. Smith goes to Washington type of guy.
He wasn't quite that homespun, huh?
No, he'd spent he'd made his bones, in Illinois, very much doing what politicians do, and he certainly played the political game very well once he got to Washington. Although, like I say, his positions drove everybody away from him for a long time during the presidency.
What about who would define for us, if you would, Larry, who were some of his sort of political enemies, whether they were individuals or groups, and tell us how he had to battle that.
Okay. Well, obviously, the Democrats were the people, he had to battle the Democrats. They had been in power as long as anybody could remember. And they were shocked and outraged that this brand new Republican Party had come in and taken what they, just figured they would elect Democrats forever. So they, they decided that, they hated the fact that he had taken the nation into war. A lot of them didn't agree with the war, especially in the northwestern states and things like that. So the Democrats, and the thing about the Democrats too was the fact that they had the press in their pocket. Back in those days, the press wasn't supposed to be fair and balanced. It was everybody knew it was just the press was in the pocket of the politicians. As a matter of fact, that's how they made their money. They would support a politician, and that politician would reward them by giving them a bunch of government contracts. So, with Democrats having been in power for so long, the press was highly Democratic, and it was their duty to wound this guy Lincoln at every opportunity. So he really took it in the short, so to speak, in the press, and he really had a hard time with the mainstream press in the North all being Democratic, or much of it being Democratic. So that was on one side. And by the way, the parties have switched places between now and then. So the Democrats were the conservatives. They didn't really see anything wrong with slavery. They were outraged when Lincoln tried to dismantle it. It was a large part of the wealth of the nation was invested in slaves, and the Democratic Party was centered in the South. So even in the North, there were, the Democratic Party was very much against Lincoln's whole thrust on slavery. And then at the other side of the spectrum were the abolitionist Republicans, who hated him too. They didn't think he was really on their side. Even after the Emancipation Proclamation, they thought, he felt like he had to do it. Look at the language of the Emancipation Proclamation, they said. It's not really, it doesn't sound like he has his heart in it. And the abolitionists were the strongest part of the Republican Party. They were the most unified, the most famous guys. Your Charles Francis Adams, John Quincy Adams' son, John Adams' grandson, just kind of horrified by this Westerner who'd come in and come in and taken over the nation. People like Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, all these very well-heeled people from the East were horrified by Lincoln as well. They didn't think he was one of them. So from both sides, especially the abolitionists, and they were on the left because they were the most liberal, and the Democrats, who were on the right because they were the most conservative, none of them, that Lincoln was not their man.
Larry, I'm going to mess up my American history here, but if my poor memory serves me right, was he not the president elected from the most farthest west state at the time?
Yes, he was. Very good. Yeah, I think nobody had ever been elected from west of the Alleghenies,
Okay.
And this guy and you're right, Illinois, that was the sucker state, they called it.
Yeah.
It was just a bunch of farmers and yahoos from the backwoods.
Right. Let me.
He made a strength of that in his 1860 campaign with the whole rail splitter thing, That's all he campaigned on, was just his image as the rail splitter. He was this guy that that came down the road with an axe and split your rails for you. And in 1860, the reason he could do that was that in 1860 the Democrats committed suicide by running two candidates. They had kind of like what would happen these days if Hillary and Obama were to run at the same time. Yeah, the Republicans would have no problem winning the election. Well, the same thing happened in reverse. Back in 1860, the Democrats ran two candidates, and Lincoln was a shoo-in for the 1860 election.
I want to veer a little bit off the essence of the battles that made Abraham Lincoln from the halls of Congress and across the land. And I want to take us inside the White House. And again, I know you're not an expert on this particular area, but we also know that Lincoln had quite an embattled family life as well. Surely that contributed as well.
Yeah. He was unfortunate in the fact that Mary was so erratic. She had a lot of mental problems, and he loved her. The family was huge. Was a huge part of his life. He had, 4 sons. 2 of them died while he, was alive. One of them died when he was in office. But yeah, Mary had her own problems. She would, for example, go to New York and buy. She had a shopping problem where she would, go to New York and buy everything in sight, and it was the taxpayers that had to pay for it because the Lincolns personally had no money.
She did it without a credit card.
Yeah, she did, and she knew she was, she knew it was a no-no, and she did it anyway. So she was all, writhing and self-reproach when she'd get back to the White House. And, Abraham Lincoln he had to be a real forgiving soul, just in his own family life. But, he was, there was so much involved in running the Civil War at the time. He and Mary really didn't see a whole lot of each other while the Civil War was going on.
How did he, from your opinion, Larry, and again, there's a lot of specifics in the book, but in particular, how, in your opinion, was the presidency altered, changed, or viewed differently as a result of his presidency?
Well, that's one of the things that I'll call them the Lincoln haters. That's one of the things that they really take him to task for. Was he came into office in the heyday of the congressional. Back in those days, the Congress was the branch of government that everybody followed. Like I say, the presidency was in such disrepute that Congress was where everything got done. And people still hold Lincoln responsible for the ascendancy of the presidency over the Congress, which he did. Absolutely true. He, and he did everything by these proclamations, which are essentially, fiat. I mean, we would have the same problem today if the president just made a proclamation and said, everybody south of this line loses the value of your home, which is kind of something in the neighborhood of what he did when he called slaves no longer property, because so much money was the wealth of the nation was tied up in the value of the slaves. But he did everything by proclamation, and he completely bypassed Congress on all the important stuff. And if that happened today, it was the congressmen who, as I said earlier, the abolitionists and the Democrats, but the congressmen were another group that hated Lincoln. He'd taken away their power. Who was this Western guy that had just come into the White House and was doing everything by proclamation? The same thing would be true today, except that now, we kind of take for granted the imperial presidency, and he's got 1 million people in all the agencies that the White House runs. So we're more used to it today. But back when he came into office, Lincoln had 2 people working for the executive branch of the government. Well, that's not quite true, because the departments were part of the executive part, but he had 2 people on his staff. He had 2 secretaries. And So everything that has happened between then and now, as far as the aggrandizement of the presidency, people that don't like that, that's who they hold responsible, is Abraham Lincoln.
Well, it is a fascinating work, a fascinating president during a fascinating time in American history. The work is The Battles That Made Abraham Lincoln. Author is Lincoln expert Larry Tagg. Larry, how can people find out more about your work and also specifically get a copy of this book?
Well, they're just getting ready to print it up now, so it's an Amazon.com. There's a earlier version called The Unpopular Mr. Lincoln, and the new version is The Battles That Made Abraham Lincoln. Amazon.com is a good way. And I'm sure it'll be in the stores pretty soon if it's not already. I think they're just readying all the printing right now because I'm writing the new introduction to it. But they can get it the usual way.
Well, listen, I appreciate your time today. Fascinating subject, and best of luck to you. And maybe have you back on again and talk even more about Abe Lincoln.
Warner, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.